What would you do if a man ran into a blazing fire to save your life, then vanished like he never existed? A mysterious fire in the middle of the night, a woman pulled from the flames by the arms of a stranger, and years later, that same man returns, quietly rebuilding everything, yet refusing to be known. Was it fate or just a debt left unpaid? Stay until the end to uncover the staggering truth behind an anonymous man and a home reborn from the ashes. Don't forget to hit subscribe and comment below. Would you forgive someone who walked away without saying goodbye? The story begins right now. It was a night of relentless rain, the wind howling through the gnarled trees on the edge of Briarwood Crest. From afar, the sharp crackle of fire shattered the stillness of the valley. Ashgrove's stable, weathered and frail after years of neglect, had become a roaring inferno in the dead of night. Lillian Windsor, asleep alone in the nearby cabin, was jolted awake by the frantic cries of the sheep. She ran outside barefoot, her feet sinking into the freezing mud, struggling to drag the rusted hose closer to the barn. But it was useless. The water pressure was barely a trickle. Everything seemed to be working against her. And then, amid her panic, there was a sound behind her, a presence. Without a word, a man burst past her, broke open the stable door, and swept her into his arms just as the wooden beams began to collapse. Smoke and ash cloaked his face, but she saw it. His eyes, fierce yet tender, like they had known her for a long time. But before she could speak, before she could even ask who he was, he turned back into the fire and vanished. That was the last time she saw him. Everyone said she imagined it. That fear had made her hallucinate. There were no footprints, no trace of the man. No one knew who he was, but Lillian knew one thing with absolute certainty. If not for him, she wouldn't be alive. And from that night on, one question haunted her through the years that followed. Why did he disappear? And if he ever came back, would I recognize him? But life never comes with a warning, because when he returned, he wasn't the man from her memories. There was no fire, no smoke, just a quiet stranger stepping into her world again. This time, without a single flame. After that night, Lillian Windsor never saw the world the same way again. The fire hadn't just destroyed the stable, it had burned away the last fragile threads of hope she was holding on to. A year earlier, her husband, Vincent Monroe, a successful businessman, had walked out on her and the farm after a single vicious argument over mounting debts. He left behind a trail of unpaid bills, a field of dying grass, and a heart so broken, Lillian didn't know where to begin picking up the pieces. But she didn't give up, not because she was strong, but because there was no other choice. Each morning before the sun rose, she fed the sheep, checked the rotting fence posts, then returned to her makeshift kitchen table to crunch numbers and try once again to make the math of survival work. Each night, she sat by the old fireplace, gripping the stack of rejection letters from banks who had denied her loan for the sixth time. Everyone in Willowmere Hollow thought she was delusional for still clinging to Briarwood Crest. To them, the farm was long gone. But to Lillian, it was the last living trace of her mother, the woman who once sowed the first seeds into this soil with calloused hands and lullabies whispered into autumn air. One freezing afternoon, as Lillian strained to drag a collapsed beam from the scorched remains of the stable, her torn glove caught on a nail. It ripped her skin open, and she collapsed, knees hitting the cold earth, her breath catching in the wind's cruel howl. And that's when she heard it, the steady, deliberate sound of a hammer striking wood, coming from the barn. No one had been hired, no one had been called, but someone was repairing what had been broken. When Lillian ran toward the sound, all she saw was the back of a man. He didn't say his name. He didn't ask for anything. He just nodded and kept working, as if he had always belonged here. And Lillian's heart, so long hardened by silence and ash, skipped. Just once, but enough to feel it. Gabriel Vaughn appeared like a wisp of smoke. No one knew where he came from, and no one had the chance to ask why he was there. The morning after the storm, Lillian opened her door and froze. Part of the collapsed stable roof had been braced with new timber. The charred black scars still stained the old wall, but every fresh beam Every nail seemed placed with a strange kind of patient gentleness, as if someone had listened to the silence of the wood before driving it home. No greetings, no lingering looks. Gabriel simply bowed his head and returned to his work, as if it were a duty, as if he already knew every grain of wood, every stone in this place. He didn't take money, didn't accept coffee, never asked for shelter, only nodded slightly when Lillian quietly offered a glass of water, and then turned back to the task, hammer in hand. Once she noticed his fingers trembling as he lifted a heavy beam. She wanted to ask, but his eyes, shadowed by dust and sweat, held a sorrow too deep to name, and the question died on her lips. Rumors swirled through Willowmere. Some said he was a drifter, a wandering carpenter. Others claimed he was running from something or someone. But Lillian saw something else. She saw a man rebuilding more than a barn. She saw someone stitching together a piece of himself. And from that day on, every morning began with the rhythmic thud of nails meeting wood, the scent of fresh pine mingling with the morning mist, and the silhouette of a man whose name she'd never asked, but whom she found herself thinking about more and more. He never spoke, but every strike of his hammer said something. Every rafter he raised was a quiet question. Can a place once burned ever be made whole again? And can someone who's been broken help another rise too? She never saw him arrive, but every morning the signs were there. A plank replaced, a crooked door made straight. Gabriel Vaughn didn't say much, yet with each passing day the barn looked a little less broken, and Lillian felt something stir inside her, something she didn't dare name. But not everyone felt it the way she did. Scarlett Monroe, the housekeeper who had lived at Briarwood Crest for nearly 30 years, watched him with quiet suspicion. "Where did he come from, Lillian?" she asked while peeling apples. "No papers, no explanations. Doesn't take pay. You think a man like that shows up for no reason?" The words left a hairline crack in Lillian's heart. She knew Scarlett wasn't the type to jump at shadows. This was the woman who had watched her grow up, who had stood by her side when Vincent walked away without a goodbye, who had held her through the silent collapse of that winter night, when the bank threatened to take the only home she had left. "He might be a good man, Scarlett," Lillian said softly. "Or maybe just someone trying to find his place in the world again." Scarlett laid the knife down, eyes fixed on her with a mix of protection and worry. "That's exactly what scares me," she whispered. "Someone trying to find themselves can be more dangerous than someone who's already lost." That day, Lillian brought Gabriel a cup of coffee, hotter than usual, and for the first time he accepted it. But when their hands brushed, she recoiled slightly. A scar ran down his wrist, faint, old, but not quite healed. In that fleeting moment, she didn't know what gripped her chest harder: the seed of doubt Scarlett had planted, or the feeling that she had seen pain like that on someone else a long time ago. There was something about Gabriel Vaughn that made people hesitate before asking too much. Maybe it was his eyes. Maybe it was the quiet way he always seemed to know exactly where the line was and never crossed it. He lived alone in Elder Pine Cottage, a long-abandoned house at the end of the Pine Ridge. No electricity, no running water, no footprints since the last owner passed away. No one really understood why Gabriel chose to stay there, or why every evening, just as the light began to fade, he slipped away from the farm, as if the night itself offered him some kind of shelter. He never took payment, not out of pride, but because what he needed couldn't be found in anyone's wallet. Once, Lillian left a small envelope beside his cup of coffee. Inside was a bit of money, and a simple note: "Because you deserve it." The next morning she found it folded neatly, untouched. Alongside it, scribbled in uneven handwriting: "I was once paid very well to lose everything." The words were few, but they cut like a blade. Gabriel never spoke of the past, but his hands did. Calloused, cracked, etched with the kind of stories no voice dares tell. One rainy afternoon, a heavy tree splintered and crashed down across the southern fence. By the time Lillian arrived, he was already there, straining to push the trunk away from the panicked sheep. His arm bloodied, his back soaked through. "You could have called me," she said, breathless. "I would have come." He shook his head, tired. "I did call," he murmured, But no one came. So I learned how to do it alone. And maybe that was the moment she understood. He hadn't come here to find a place to stay. He came to find the pieces of himself he'd lost. Every morning, before the sun had a chance to dry the dew from the grass at Briarwood Crest, Lillian Windsor would quietly leave a warm thermos of coffee and a homemade almond scone on the stable windowsill. No note, no expectations. Just a silent way of saying, "Thank you." Gabriel Vaughn never touched the food in front of her. But one morning he kept the paper cup, with a faint smudge of lipstick still on the rim, and carefully placed it on a wooden shelf inside Elderpine Cottage, like it was something sacred. Trust didn't come through stories. It came through repetition, small gestures, unspoken rhythms, a nod instead of a greeting, a hand reaching for a heavy beam before she even asked, and the silence between them slowly became less of an absence, and more of a shelter for two souls worn down by too many cracks. One morning she rushed to the back paddock after hearing the sheep had panicked during the night. She was breathless when she arrived, only to find a lamb trapped in the fence. Gabriel was already there, kneeling in the rain, his only jacket wrapped around the shivering creature. "She won't survive the cold unless we warm her up," he said, his voice trembling. Not from fear, but from the sheer weight of letting someone see his softness. Lillian knelt beside him, hands numb as she lit a fire from damp wood, and together they shielded the lamb with their own bodies for over an hour. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds and the little creature let out a faint bleat, she turned to Gabriel and saw him smile. Not a smile of gratitude, but one that said, "I'm not alone anymore." And then Ash Grove Stable, the place once half devoured by fire, began to breathe again. Gabriel Vaughn never said much, but his hands told stories. Each new beam was anchored with the rusted hammer he brought from Elderpine Cottage. Every crack in the brick wall was patched with obsessive precision, as if he were mending something deeper, something broken inside his own heart. No pay, no reminders. Gabriel was always the first to arrive, the last to leave, and he was always gone before Lillian could say thank you. Every corner of the rebuilt stable held a part of him: a feed trough carved from old maple wood, a wind chime crafted from scorched scrap metal, a simple bench placed by the window, the one with the most beautiful view of sunset, a view Lillian had never noticed before. One afternoon, a support beam collapsed from the roof, falling just as Scarlett was leading the sheep across the yard. Without hesitation, Gabriel threw himself forward, shielding her with his own body. The beam tore a long gash across his arm, blood soaking through his shirt. He refused the hospital, just wrapped it himself with a strip of fabric, and kept going, as if pain was something he'd long stopped negotiating with. "Why are you doing all this?" Lillian asked one twilight evening, not really expecting an answer. Gabriel turned to the doorway, where the last golden light spilled across the air, thick with sawdust. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "Because this place deserves to live again." In that moment, Lillian didn't yet know. What he truly longed to rebuild wasn't just the stable. It was the trust he had once lost in himself. And somehow, without needing to understand all the pieces, she felt it. Felt it in a way deeper than words could ever explain. That day, just as Gabriel unloaded the last bundle of lumber from the truck, something unexpected happened. Fang, the German shepherd who guarded Ash Grove Stable with unwavering vigilance, known to trust no one but Lillian, suddenly walked toward Gabriel. Not with suspicion in his eyes, as he usually did, but with a strange stillness, as if recognizing someone familiar in a world that had long forgotten him. Gabriel paused, startled. He slowly reached out his hand and whispered the name he used to call the strays at the old rescue shelter. "Hey, boy." Fang didn't bark, didn't back away. He sniffed Gabriel's hand and then pressed his head gently into it. The first gesture of acceptance. Scarlett, watching from a distance, froze in disbelief. And Lillian, she stood motionless beneath the porch. Not because of Fang's reaction, but because of the look in Gabriel's eyes. It was the look of someone who had once lost everything and couldn't believe he was being welcomed again, even if only by a dog. That night, a passing storm swept through the valley. Winds tore off the back corner of the tin roof. As everyone scrambled to brace the structure, Fong panicked and bolted through the fence, charging straight into the flooded fields. Gabriel didn't hesitate, no second thoughts. He sprinted after him, leaping over the ditch, slipping hard into the mud. By the time he reached Fang, they were both soaked to the bone. Gabriel pulled him close, his arms trembling from the cold, his lips pressed tight, as if afraid that opening them would let something sacred fall apart. Lillian watched from afar, and something cracked inside her, too. Not just because of his courage, but because, in that moment, she understood. This man wasn't just rebuilding a stable. He was fighting to belong, piece by piece, moment by moment. That night, the sky held its breath over the crest of Briarwood. Lillian sat on the porch steps, hands wrapped around a still warm cup of tea. Gabriel was quietly fastening the latch on the newly hinged barn door. The golden light spilled softly into the mist, and the space between them was now only a few steps wide. "My father once trusted a friend," Lillian said softly, not looking at him. "They grew up together, built this land side by side, and then, with a single signature, he lost everything, lost his faith in people." Her voice wasn't angry. It sounded more like a confession. And it wasn't really about her father. It was about her, the kind of fear that grows roots so deep, you stop noticing it's even there. The fear of trusting the wrong person again. The fear of losing all over again. Gabriel didn't answer, but he didn't pull away either. He sat beside her, not too close, not too far, just close enough to say, "I'm here." Lillian kept speaking, her voice slower now, almost cracking. "My mother left after that. She said she couldn't stand watching him fall apart, day by day. She turned to him then, eyes meeting his without hesitation. 'I'm not afraid of being poor. I'm not afraid of working until my hands bleed. I'm afraid of believing in someone and watching them disappear without a word.'" Gabriel's hand tightened, just slightly, but it was enough to reveal the faint scar along his wrist. Lillian noticed, but she didn't ask. He didn't make a promise, didn't offer comfort. But for the first time, there was something deeply human in his gaze, remorse, and a kind of aching empathy so raw, it almost hurt to witness. And then, like a quiet miracle in the dark, a firefly floated between them, just one. And in that stillness, without a single word exchanged, they both felt it. Something had just been laid down between them, a corner of the heart, a fragile offering of trust. Morning mist still clung to the fields of Briarwood Crest as Gabriel laid the first beam onto the cold earth, right where the old fence had rotted through the winter before. Lillian stood beside him, holding her father's worn hammer, the same one her late mother once used to hang the first spring orchids on the porch. With every strike of the nail, every steady lift of wood, it felt less like they were building a fence and more like they were piecing together something that had once fallen apart. Not just timber, but memory. "There used to be a maple tree right here," Lillian said, pointing to a patch of earth near the porch. "My mother planted it on my 7th birthday. It would drop its leaves every fall, and she never let anyone sweep them too quickly. She used to say, 'Memories need time to fall and time to rest.'" Gabriel paused, still. Then without a word, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Inside was a young maple sapling, carefully wrapped in faded newspaper. "I found it, growing on its own near the old shed," he said quietly. "No one seemed to notice it, but the wind still helped it hold on." Lillian stared at him, stunned. In that moment, she understood. The only thing Gabriel had carried from the world outside wasn't luggage, it wasn't a name. It was this fragile branch, a new life born from neglect. She knelt beside him, and together they planted it beneath the window her mother once stood at, steeping morning tea in the silence of dawn. That evening, as the sun cast its gold across the distant tree line, the new fence stood tall, like a picture frame, holding the house close, as if to say, "You're safe now." And beneath the young maple, Lillian felt something ease within her. She didn't know what was coming next, but she knew with quiet certainty. She wasn't rebuilding alone anymore. That night the wind whispered through the window panes, soft, haunting, like it carried truths no one dared to say aloud. In the small kitchen of Briarwood Crest, the firelight danced across Gabriel Vaughn's face, casting flickering shadows over the quiet grief that had followed him like a second skin for years. Lillian set her teacup down, ready to speak. But Gabriel spoke first. His voice wasn't loud, but every word felt heavy, as if dragged from a place buried deep beneath the surface. "I used to be a CEO," he said, eyes fixed on the fire. "Ran a tech company, high-rise apartment, luxury car. They used to call me the genius of rebuilding." He paused, his voice catching. "But I missed my daughter's 7th birthday because of a meeting I told myself couldn't be canceled." He swallowed hard. "That same day, my wife and little girl were in a car crash. They were on their way to see me. If I hadn't told her to leave early, if I'd just gone home to pick them up myself." Lillian didn't move. She had never seen anyone bow to their past like that. Not to beg for forgiveness, but to admit, with brutal honesty, that they had failed the very thing most worth protecting. Gabriel turned away, but his voice trembled as it spilled into the silence. "I didn't come here to rebuild a barn. I came here to be punished." He exhaled, almost as if ashamed. "But then I saw you, standing beneath that little maple. You didn't ask questions. You didn't judge. You just left a small pastry on the doorstep and walked away." And in that breath of stillness, something shifted between them. Not pity, not explanation, just a kind of quiet understanding that exists only between those who've known real loss. Lillian didn't speak. She simply stood, walked over, and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Not to comfort, but to say, "You are no longer a man punishing himself. You're part of something now. A home, a healing, a return." It was supposed to be a quiet morning, but the pounding on the front door shattered the calm at Briarwood Crest. Lillian opened it and found herself staring at 3 news vans, a blonde reporter, and at least 5 cameras pointed straight at the house. A house that had only ever known the sounds of wind and distant barking dogs. "We just want confirmation," the reporter pressed, voice clipped and urgent. "Is this where Gabriel Vaughn is staying? The billionaire who vanished 3 years ago?" Lillian froze. The answer caught in her throat, and before she could speak, Gabriel emerged from the barn, sawdust in his hair, paint on his sleeves, nothing about him resembling the man once plastered across financial headlines. Their eyes met, and in that single look, there was understanding, but also fear. She saw it clearer than ever. He hadn't come here to be found. He had come to disappear, to rebuild from the bottom of everything. Gabriel said nothing. He simply turned and walked toward Elder Pine Cottage, closing the old wooden door behind him, like drawing a curtain on a world he had never wanted back. Fang barked sharply, stepping between the press and the threshold, as if guarding someone it had already claimed as family. That night, Lillian found Gabriel sitting alone in the dark. The faint glow of a lamp lit up a faded photograph he held. His wife and daughter, smiles forever frozen in a past that refused to let go. "You don't have to hide anymore," she whispered. But Gabriel shook his head, the corners of his mouth lifting in a tired, bitter smile. "I'm not hiding," he said softly. "I just don't know if I deserve to belong to anyone anymore." And in that moment, in his quiet retreat instead of defiant explanation, Lillian understood something she hadn't before. True goodness doesn't need the spotlight. It just needs to be trusted. But because of that, she also knew what she had to do. She had to bring him back, not to the world he left behind, but to a new kind of home, where he no longer had to hide any part of who he was. The media storm hadn't yet settled, but inside Lillian, another storm had already begun to roar. It wasn't about Gabriel being a billionaire. It was about trust. A trust she had given for the first time in years to someone she realized she didn't truly know at all. She sat beneath the young maple tree on the porch, the one they had replanted together. Its leaves hadn't even had the chance to turn green, and already her trust had fallen. In her hands was a wrinkled newspaper clipping. Gabriel smiling in a tailored suit, a world away from the man she knew. The man who once stood in the rain hammering roof tiles one by one in silence. Was all of it just penance for your past? She whispered bitterly. Because when trust is broken, it doesn't just hurt, it erases everything you thought was real. Gabriel didn't defend himself. He left everything behind. The tools, the sketches, even the handmade bench he'd carved with care, and walked away from Briarwood Crest like a ghost fading into fog. Scarlett found Lillian alone in the barn, wiping down the unfinished frame he never got to complete. Some people never learned how to stay, she said gently, because they lost everything, trying to hold on. Among the shards of what had been, Lillian didn't cry, but the way she tucked Gabriel's wooden box into the deepest drawer, not locked away, just waiting, was her way of saying, I haven't forgiven you, but I haven't let you go either, because what hurt most wasn't that he had lied. It was that something between them, something that had felt achingly real, couldn't survive when light finally touched the shadows. The next morning, Elder Pine Cottage was unnervingly still. The door was left unlocked. A half-full cup of coffee sat cooling on the counter. Lillian stood at the window he used to wipe clean each morning, the one Gabriel would quietly gaze through before starting his day. But today, there was no trace of him. No soft thud of wood, no footsteps on the porch. Only a folded piece of paper left on the worn wooden table. She opened it. The handwriting was slanted, rushed, as if the writer had tried to hold back words too heavy to finish. If there's any place that feels like starting over, for me, it could only ever be here. No explanations, no apologies, no promises to return. Just silence, the kind that splits you open. The silence of someone who couldn't stay because they weren't sure they deserved to be forgiven. Lillian stepped out of the cottage, past the barn where Gabriel had spent hours repairing every brittle plank. She saw the gloves he left behind, the small wooden bench he never finished, still missing one final corner. On the edge of a timber slab, she spotted a carving, rough made by blade. Lillian, and beneath it, a small crescent mark, half a heart, missing its other half. Scarlett stood behind her, quiet. She placed a gentle hand on Lillian's shoulder and whispered, He didn't leave to walk away. He left, so you could choose. Lillian gave a soft nod, but she didn't turn around, because deep down what broke her more than the lies was the loss of something that could have been forever, if only he'd stayed a little longer. And in that moment, she understood. Gabriel didn't walk away because he wanted to. He walked away because he didn't believe he was worthy of staying. The media frenzy hadn't yet faded when a different storm struck, one that moved silently, beneath headlines and camera flashes. Whispers surged through the investment world. Old photographs of Gabriel as a CEO resurfaced, along with questions that had never truly been answered. Business partners pulled out. The contract for the new stable was canceled. Feed orders were left in limbo. In just 3 days, Briarwood Crest went from a place reborn to the brink of ruin. Lillian sat motionless in the darkened living room, the silence thick and heavy. Outside, Fang let out a low, mournful howl, as if even he could feel the hope draining from the land that had once begun to heal. Scarlett stepped in quietly, placing a cup of tea on the table before gently squeezing Lillian's hand. There were no words left that could soften the exhaustion in her eyes. Maybe it's time to let go, Lillian whispered, voice cracking. I tried to hold on to this place like I was holding on to my mother, but in the end, I'm losing that too. She rose and walked to the front porch, to the young maple she and Gabriel had planted. A promise in the soil that now felt like a broken vow. Its leaves had turned yellow, some branches sagging from neglect. Her hand trembled as she touched the trunk, still bearing the faded carving. His name, half etched, half worn away by wind and time. Then something caught her eye. A faint crack beneath the roots. She knelt down, gently digging, until her fingers uncovered a small wooden box buried with care. Inside was a complete architectural plan for the new stable, dated 1 week before the media leak. Attached to it, a signed transfer of investment shares from an anonymous company. The name on the final line, Gabriel Vaughn. And in that moment, the truth hit her like a wave. He never left her. Not really. Even when she turned away, he had still been fighting, quietly, invisibly, to save the place she loved, to save them, even when she no longer had the faith to look back. Rain began to fall softly, each drop tapping gently against the wooden eaves of Briarwood Crest, like a slow, sorrowful rhythm echoing through a day that had already sunk to the bottom of hope. Lillian sat in silence in the kitchen, her hands still wrapped tightly around the small wooden box she had unearthed from beneath the maple tree. There were no more tears to shed, but her heart felt like it had been tied to a stone and pulled under. Then Scarlett appeared in the doorway, holding a steaming cup of tea. She didn't speak right away. She simply placed the cup on the table and stood still, her gaze cutting straight through Lillian's silence. "You know," Scarlett began, her voice low but steady, "the person who saved this farm last year, it wasn't a bank, and it wasn't some faceless organization like you thought." Lillian looked up, eyes desperate to hold on to even the faintest thread of hope. "It was Gabriel Vaughn," Scarlett continued. "He quietly bought out the bad debt, wiped the interest, the principal, every last cent." She paused. "He made me promise not to tell you." "But why?" Lillian's voice cracked open, barely audible. Scarlett sighed, reaching into her coat pocket. She pulled out an aged envelope. Inside was a contract, the name of the investment company, Elm and Stone Investments. And at the bottom, in clean, unmistakable script, G.V. "He knew you'd never accept help if you knew it was from him," Scarlett said gently. "But without Gabriel, this place would have been sold off to a resort developer last spring." Silence settled across the kitchen like a soft blanket. And in that moment, Lillian felt her world tilt. The man she thought had betrayed her, the man she believed had hidden too much, was the one who had protected her all along, even before they had truly learned to say each other's names. Outside, Fang let out a quiet bark, a call almost, and the rain had begun to ease. Late in the afternoon, sunlight spilled softly through the leaves of the young maple, now reviving after a long, unforgiving winter. Lillian walked quietly to its base, the place where she and Gabriel had once planted it together on a morning that felt strangely sacred. The earth beneath her feet was still damp from the night's rain. Her hands trembled as she held the small spade, digging through the soil with the care of someone unearthing more than just dirt, but memory. Moments later, the metal edge struck something solid, a weathered wooden box, its surface worn and pale, etched with the words, "If there's any place I belong." She opened it with the caution of a soul teetering between doubt and belief. Inside was a silver ring, scuffed, but catching the light with quiet resilience, and a folded sheet of paper, a blueprint, the design for Ashgrove's new roof, the one Gabriel had poured every ounce of himself into. But it wasn't the drawing that stole her breath. It was the line written on the back in his unmistakable hand. "For the day she believes in love." One more time. Lillian collapsed to her knees, not out of sentiment, but because regret and sorrow surged through her, like wind pushing against the grain of every memory. She had doubted the one person who chose to stay when everyone else had walked away, turned her back on a love that had never even asked to be named. The breeze swept through her hair, soft, almost like a whisper, and in that quiet moment, she knew she had to go. Not for an apology, but for something far greater. The chance to rewrite an ending that had never been meant to stay unfinished. An ending where the ring would no longer stay buried in a box, and the stable roof would rise, not just from wood and nails, but from something rebuilt, from the heart. She began the search with her heart pounding wildly in her chest, not out of hope, but out of fear. Fear of hoping again. Lillian followed the few scattered clues Gabriel had left behind. They led her to Haven Ridge Falls, a small town tucked deep into the woods where birdsong outnumbered cell towers, and the silence felt more like sanctuary than emptiness. She hadn't expected it to be this peaceful. The Haven Ridge Animal Rescue Center sat quietly beneath a line of old pines, its roof moss-covered but clean and cared for. And there, bathed in the soft light of a fading sun, was Gabriel. No dust-covered flannel, No tension in his posture, only gentleness. As he knelt to stroke the head of a three-legged dog, his face softer than she'd ever seen it, Lillian stood frozen. The sight tore through every last wall inside her. The man once called a billionaire now lived simply, healing not through wealth, but through presence. "I didn't think you'd come," Gabriel said, his voice low, rough, as if he'd swallowed thousands of unsaid things just to speak this one truth. "But I left the box because I needed you to know. If you ever wanted to find me, you could." Lillian bit her lip, hard. The blame she once held, the questions, the running, all of it she now saw hadn't come from his silence. It had come from her not being ready to truly hear him. They stood there, surrounded by the soft rustling of paws and tails, as if the whole world had paused to let something fall gently back into place. And when she stepped forward, there were no tears, no accusations, just a hand, trembling, reaching for his. Two people who had dropped everything, now learning how to gather it back, piece by piece with their own bare hands. No apologies needed, just presence. A gentle breeze swept over the hills of Briarwood Crest that autumn morning, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass and pine wood. Beneath the young maple tree, once left brittle and bare after a merciless winter, now lush and full of life, a quiet ceremony unfolded. There was no grand dress, no rehearsed vows, only two people who had been broken, choosing to stand beside each other one more time. Lillian wore a simple white dress, sewn long ago by her mother's hands. Gabriel brought the old ring box, the one he had buried beneath this very tree, a silent promise carved in hope long before he believed he deserved another chance. Scarlet dabbed at her eyes behind the last row of chairs, trying not to be seen. And Fang, the dog who once trusted no one, now lay quietly at their feet, a living symbol of what it means to choose again. There was no pastor, no altar, only truth. "I can't promise I'll never hurt you," Gabriel said, his voice cracking with honesty. "But I promise I'll stay. Even when it's hard, especially then." Lillian reached for his hand, the same hand that rebuilt fallen beams, that hammered roofs back into place, and long ago carried her out of a fire when she didn't know how to believe in anyone anymore. No one spoke as they exchanged one final look, a gaze that said everything their vows didn't, before leaning in for the first kiss of their second beginning. No fanfare, no headlines, just the kind of love you fight to keep once you've learned what it means to lose. And just then, a few early maple leaves floated down, as if whispered from the mother who once believed this land could be a home. If two hearts ever found their way back, they didn't start over. They started from the fracture and chose together to make it whole again. On the first morning after the wedding, sunlight stretched softly across the hills of Briarwood Crest, casting gold over the newly built stable and the rows of maple trees turning to fire. A new wooden sign hung quietly by the gate, its carving simple but full of meaning: Briarwood Crest, where healing begins again. Just beneath it, Fang, the German shepherd who once flinched at every stranger, now darted joyfully through the pasture, herding sheep with the ease of something that had finally come home. What once felt broken now pulsed with a quiet rhythm of life, gentle, steady, and stronger than before. In the small kitchen, Lillian set a kettle on the old wood stove. Outside, Gabriel was crafting another bench by the fence, the very spot where they once sat in silence, sharing pastries and unspoken wounds. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Each glance now carried what words never could. We chose right, even if the road was winding. On a freshly painted wall, Lillian hung an old photograph, her mother smiling beneath the maple tree. A quiet offering, a way of giving memory its place again. And in doing so, Gabriel, through his quiet presence, had mended more than beams and fences. He had mended what lived inside her. Dear friend, if you've ever felt like you no longer had a place to call home, maybe this story is a small reminder. Home might not be a location. It might simply be the person willing to rebuild it with you from the ashes. If this story found you at the right time, leave us a comment below. about the one person you once wished would take your hand and walk through the fire with you. And if your heart needs more stories like this, stories that men, that remember, that begin again, hit subscribe. Because maybe the next story will be yours. There are lives that seem beyond repair. There are people who appear too far gone to be saved. But sometimes, a single quiet act is enough to change everything. The story of Lillian and Gabriel isn't just a love story between two wounded souls. It's a symphony of redemption, trust, and the fragile, beautiful power of beginning again, even when it feels like there's nothing left to save. Gabriel was once a man at the peak of power, wealth, recognition, and then he lost it all because of one devastating choice. He chose to disappear, to live as a ghost in a world he no longer believed he deserved. But instead of surrendering to the dark, he used his hands, not to reclaim control, but to rebuild a broken barn, replant a forgotten fence, and quietly resurrect something that once felt like home. Not for himself, but for a woman he barely knew, who was clinging to her last shred of hope. Lillian, even after all she lost, didn't close her heart. She gave, even without the certainty of receiving, because some things only begin when we dare to believe again. And so, on that humble farm, one learned to forgive himself. The other learned to open her heart to the past. And together, they discovered the most important truth of all. Healing doesn't come from forgetting what broke us. It comes from choosing every day to live gently from within the very place where we once fell apart. You see, sometimes the truest miracles begin in the quietest places.